Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show that takes a stack of sources, articles, research, our own notes, and really extracts the most important nuggets of knowledge or insight, giving you, hopefully, a shortcut to being truly well-informed.
And today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a concept that, well, it might sound distant or maybe highly academic.
Yeah, geopolitics.
Exactly. But as you'll soon discover, it's woven pretty intricately into the very fabric of our daily
It
lives.
really is. It's a term you hear thrown around a lot by pundits, politicians.
All the time. Yet it remains surprisingly misunderstood, doesn't it? Our mission today is basically to demystify this complex field.
And show you why understanding geopolitics isn't just, smart. It's actually essential for all of us.
It's a concept that really hits home with, well, jarring clarity when you think about events like the summer of 2006.
Oh, yeah. Remember seeing those heartbreaking images from southern Lebanon? Especially the Beirut suburbs.
Absolutely. Communities just slowly trying to rebuild after weeks and weeks of relentless bombing.
Or even the ongoing conflicts that, continue to dominate headlines. Places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan.
Or even the ones that get less coverage, like the devastating struggles in the Congo.
Right. These aren't just isolated tragedies, are they? They're really profound, real-world manifestations of complex geopolitical realities.
And what's particularly striking is how quickly these seemingly distant events can ripple out, how they touch our lives in ways we might not even consciously realize.
So our goal with this deep dive is to sort of pull back the curtain on this intricate field.
Yeah, reveal how geographical descriptions, political actions, even things that seem harmless, like popular culture,
How they actively shape our worldviews, influence the decisions of nations, and, ultimately impact our individual lives.
Our journey today is grounded in a foundational text, Geopolitics, a very short introduction by Klaus Dodds.
And his core argument is incredibly powerful, but it sounds deceptively simple.
Right, that it's not only smart, but also essential to be geopolitical.
And by the end of this conversation, you'll not only understand precisely why, but you'll have gained, hopefully, a crucial lens for interpreting the global landscape. A genuine shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
We're going to uncover some surprising connections, things like historical speeches that quite literally redrew our mental maps of the world.
To the video games you might play in your spare time.
Exactly. You'll see how all of these seemingly disparate elements come together to shape our understanding of us versus them, and ultimately, how they influence the very course of history.
Okay, so let's unpack this fascinating topic and see just how deeply geopolitics runs.
I'll do it.
So, to kick things off, let's explore that central assertion from Klaus Dodds. Why is being geopolitical not just smart, but, as he really argues, essential?
Well, that original phrase, it's smart to be geopolitical, that came from Robert Strauss-Hube. He founded the right-wing Foreign Policy Research Institute.
Right, but Dawes really takes it a step further. He pushes for its absolute necessity.
He does. He contends that despite all the optimistic talk we sometimes hear about globalization making borders irrelevant, or national sovereignty being, a relic of the past.
The stark reality is that territory, international boundaries, claims to sovereignty, they're as pressing and consequential as they've ever been.
Absolutely. And in many parts of the world, a mere few feet of land. I mean, it can literally mean the difference between life and death.
Wow. Yeah, that puts it starkly.
It really does. And what's truly illuminating here is the tangible, immediate impact of this on actual human lives.
Out so.
Well, consider how simply labeling a geographical area or an entire nation or even a specific community as dangerous, threatening, or an enemy, how that can instantly become an invitation, or maybe more accurately, a justification for military assaults from land, sea, air.
Right, like for the civilians in southern Lebanon back in the summer of 2006, that wasn't some abstract concept for them.
Not at all. It was their tragic, lived reality. Homes destroyed, families displaced, lives lost. They paid the immediate, devastating price for being in a geopolitically defined zone of threat.
And it's not just about the direct targets either, is it? It's the ripple effect, too.
Absolutely. Even countries that are supposed allies can face, well, chilling consequences within this framework.
You mean like Pakistan after 9/11?
Exactly. Think back to that period, the global war on terror. According to President Pervez Musharraf of Pakistan at the time, his nation faced the grim prospect of being bombed back to the Stone Age.
By the U.S.
By the United States, yes. If their commitment to rooting out perceived terrorists was seen as, well, wavering.
That wasn't a suggestion, was it? That was a threat.
A clear, unambiguous threat. And that anecdote just powerfully illustrates the immediate, severe consequences that come from geopolitical labeling.
And the power dynamics involved.
Absolutely. The stark power dynamics, the willingness of powerful states to impose their will based on their strategic interpretations of global threats. It just underscores why understanding the language and logic of geopolitics is so vital.
That's an incredibly stark reminder. You know, for many of us living in places like Europe or North America, there's often this comfortable distance.
It's easy to think that way.
Right. It might be tempting to think, oh, geopolitics, that's something that happens over there in more, turbulent parts of the world, a problem for other nations.
But the author, Dodds, strongly challenges this. He points out that view is just profoundly mistaken.
Because geopolitics is undeniably intertwined with our everyday lives. Even if we're lucky enough to be insulated from, say, the immediate struggles of crossing contested borders.
You're spot on. We see it in really tangible ways, even in highly developed countries.
Yeah.
Remember the immediate changes after 9/11.
That's the security threat.
The airport security suddenly ramped up everywhere. Exactly. The widespread implementation of really stringent biometric security checks at airports, seaports, that became commonplace.
That's a direct, everyday geopolitical consequence. It shapes your personal experience, adds layers of bureaucracy, surveillance.
Right. But the impact of 9/11 spread far wider globally. It triggered devastating suicide bomb attacks.
Yeah.
Bali, Casablanca, Istanbul, Jerusalem, London, Madrid.
These weren't isolated incidents. They were direct reverberations.
Direct reverberations of a single geopolitical event. It's astonishing how one act can ignite such a global chain reaction.
Indeed. And if we zoom out even further.
Yeah, the deeply controversial Anglo-American invasion of Iraq followed directly from 9/11.
Yeah.
It was justified through a geopolitical framework of, preemptive action against perceived threats.
And the human cost, astronomical.
Yeah.
And still mounting.
It is. Iraqi cities like Baghdad, Fallujah, Mosul, they've borne the brutal brunt of daily assaults, not just from coalition forces, but also internecine violence, suicide bombers, death squads.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale.
Since March 2003, NGOs estimate over 650,000 Iraqis have tragically been killed, 2 million displaced from their homes, and a staggering 10 million, that's nearly a third of the population, still don't have access to clean water.
10 million.
This grim, ongoing reality just undeniably highlights the profound interconnectedness of places and people.
It shows how geopolitical decisions made in one part of the world can reverberate with devastating, long-lasting consequences across the entire globe, affecting basic human needs, fundamental rights.
Exactly.
It's clear that some places literally demand our attention through very direct means. I mean, I still get aid appeals, informational leaflets in the mail.
For places like southern Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Afghanistan.
Right. Urging support for vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
Those are physical, tangible connections to distant geopolitical struggles.
But then there are other places, like Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia.
Yeah, that many of us are far more likely to encounter electronically.
Through the movie Black Hawk Down, for instance.
Or now you can even play the video game based on those events. It's a fascinating and, frankly, quite unsettling shift, isn't it?
It is how we engage with these distant realities, moving from direct appeals to, well, digitized combat scenarios.
So what does that mean?
Well, this brings us to a really critical point. If we are, as some prominent strategists suggest, truly entering a new age of blood and iron,
A return to more overt, kinetic geopolitical competition.
potentially, then understanding these connections, both the real and the virtual connections between places and communities, becomes absolutely vital.
The consequences of how we perceive and interact with these connections, they can't be overstated.
Precisely. And geopolitics, with its inherent focus on crucial elements like borders, resources, flows of people and goods, territory, identity, it offers a powerful pathway.
A pathway for critical analysis and understanding in a world that often feels chaotic.
Exactly. It might be seen by some as controversial because it challenges simple narratives, but it's really an indispensable pathway for navigating our complex, interconnected world.
Okay, so after establishing why geopolitics is so pervasive, so woven into our lives, we absolutely have to tackle the fundamental question. What is geopolitics?
Yeah, the big question.
If you just Google the term right now, you'd probably get, 6 or 7 million hits?
Easily. It's like trying to find a clear definition in a massive, overwhelming haystack.
The social theorist Michael Mann put it well, didn't he? He said, geopolitics, like most terms that have attracted academic attention, is slippery.
It really is slippery. It just slides around, changes meaning depending on who's using it.
What's particularly noteworthy is how often it's used as a kind of intellectual shorthand by journalists, pundits.
Figures like Thomas Barnett, Thomas Friedman, or even someone like Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
They often use these taken-for-granted geographical templates.
Like the axis of evil or outposts of tyranny, things that categorize and simplify complex global situations.
Exactly. But the absolutely critical point that the author emphasizes and that we really want you, our listener, to grasp is the profound importance of not just accepting these terms at face value.
We need to actively probe them, explore the consequences.
Yes. Explore the real-world consequences that inevitably follow when the world gets swept into such broad, often simplistic geographical divisions. We need to ask, what happens when we adopt these mental models without questioning where they came from or what they imply?
That's a crucial distinction. So for many people, especially in popular discussion, geopolitics basically serves as a kind of reliable guide to the world map.
That's the first, more common understanding, yeah.
It uses these readily available geographical descriptions, powerful metaphors, simplified templates, things like Iron Curtain, the Third World, designating a rogue state.
These terms are inherently geographical because they identify, they label, they categorize places.
And they help generate these very simple, easily digestible models of the world.
Right, which are then often used to advise, inform, and crucially justify foreign and security policy making.
It's a way to quickly frame who's good and who's bad on the global stage.
And this first understanding is definitely the most prevalent one in our everyday media. You see it constantly.
Newspapers, radio, TV news.
All the time. And it has this powerful tendency to simplify. It often reduces entire governments, complex nations, diverse populations,
Down to simple descriptors like London, Washington, or Moscow.
as if those capital cities somehow embody the entirety of their nation's incredibly complex political realities, economic challenges, cultural nuances.
Stripping away all the internal debates and diverse perspectives.
Exactly.
But then there's a second, much deeper understanding, and this is the one the author, Dodds, clearly prefers and champions in his book.
Right. This approach shifts the focus instead of just using geopolitical labels.
It zeroes in on how geopolitics actually works, as both an academic discipline and a popular practice.
Precisely. It moves beyond simply accepting labels like Iron Curtain or Axis of Evil as self-evident truths.
Instead, it critically questions how these labels are created, how they gain traction.
And how they then actively generate particular understandings of places, communities, and the identities that go with them, often reinforcing existing biases or creating new ones.
It's about the process of labeling, not just the labels themselves.
This leads us to a really fascinating example.
Yeah.
The term Third World.
Okay.
It wasn't just a neutral geographical description for places in Africa, Asia, Latin America.
No.
Rather, it actively helped to sort of triangulate and solidify the political geographies of the Cold War era.
How so?
It strategically positioned the U.S. as the first world and the Soviet Union as the second world in this fierce global ideological and power competition.
Right.
Now, while some rightly criticize the term for implicitly assuming the Third World was just this open, passive space for superpower rivalry and exploitation, what's also truly fascinating is that many leaders and intellectuals within Africa, Asia, and Latin America actually embraced the term.
Really? Why?
For them, it became a powerful way of registering their collective political and geographical difference from both the global north and the communist bloc.
So asserting their own unique identity, advocating for non-alignment.
Exactly. It became a banner under which to demand autonomy and a voice on the global stage in a really divided world.
And that second approach, focusing on how geopolitics gets used and the consequences, especially in our everyday lives, that's really the core of what this book champions.
Yes, it doesn't claim to be like a prescriptive guide for Western foreign policy or a rule book for international relations.
Its aim is much more revealing, to show the practical impact, the real-world effects, the often hidden power of these ideas and labels.
And what's universally appealing here, for leaders and pundits alike, is this allure of a God's eye view of the world.
That seemingly all-knowing, detached perspective.
Right. It often proves irresistible, especially during times of profound global crisis and war. It's perfectly understandable, really. In moments of immense uncertainty, a sweeping view that claims to offer clarity and control might seem not just necessary, but almost divinely revealed.
Like Churchill and Truman in the mid to late 1940s.
Exactly. Think about the pivotal speeches they gave then. They were navigating this incredibly fraught political and geographical landscape, desperately trying to make sense of a world ravaged by war that, paradoxically, hadn't brought stability.
I mean, within 3 years of WWI ending, the Allies were already embroiled in the Berlin crisis.
A tense standoff that could easily have escalated. And 5 years after the war, those same wartime allies plus China were confronting each other in the brutal Korean War.
A conflict that cost over 2 million lives, mostly civilian, and left the peninsula tragically divided right up to today.
So these leaders, they desperately sought a guiding framework, this God's eye view, to make sense of it all, to impose order on perceived chaos, and crucially, to rally their populations behind a common understanding of the new global enemy.
Let's talk about the sheer undeniable power of language. How it doesn't just shape perceptions, but can fundamentally dictate entire national policies.
Yeah, this is crucial.
And a prime example is one of the most iconic metaphors of the 20th century, Churchill's Iron Curtain.
Ah, yes, the Fulton speech.
March 1946, Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Churchill delivered this speech that was just a profound reassessment of the world, especially Europe, right after the war. He famously declared, and I'm quoting here, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent."
Such a powerful image.
He went on. "Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow."
The profound power of that analogy, Iron Curtain, you just can't overstate it. It conjured this very real, almost physical sense of an impermeable barrier, a tangible divide cutting sharply across a huge swath of Europe.
And the choice of Iron Curtain is so layered, isn't it?
It really is. A curtain made of iron doesn't just block sunlight, it completely foils any other kind of flow, people, goods, information, ideas.
And Churchill, a master rhetorician, consistently used light and darkness imagery.
He did. In his wartime speeches, his Cold War speeches, intentionally using this binary to convey a clear moral and political distinction between the liberal democracies of the West and the totalitarian regimes, fascist and later communist, in the East.
And that vivid phrase just stuck in the geographical imaginations on both sides of the Atlantic. It instantly created this clear mental model of a divided continent.
Its powerful legacy was then reinforced later by President Reagan's equally impactful description of the Soviet Union as an evil empire in 1982.
Interestingly, though, the Soviet media never actually published Churchill's speech for their own citizens.
No, they didn't. And Stalin, in fact, cleverly used it to his advantage. He portrayed the West as this aggressive, hostile threat to his own populace, which helped justify his consolidation of power and the need for a strong Soviet state.
And it wasn't just Churchill. President Truman, another key architect of the post-war world, also masterfully used his speeches to interpret and represent this rapidly changing global landscape in the late 1940s.
The Truman Doctrine speech is a classic example.
Exactly. In that powerful address to Congress in March 1947, he presented this incredibly stark, almost binary view of global choices. He said, "At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one."
And then he laid out the two paths.
Right. One he described as based upon the will of the majority, distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, and guarantees of individual liberty.
The Western model.
And the other he starkly contrasted as based upon the will of a minority forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms.
That speech was undeniably instrumental. It profoundly shapes the post-1945 geographical imagination of the U.S. and really the wider world.
How did it do that?
Well, after looking carefully at the fragile situations in Greece and Turkey where communist insurgencies were gaining ground, Truman offered this deceptively simple yet politically effective division, these alternative ways of life.
Creating a clear ideological fault line.
Exactly. Distinguishing between countries supposedly supporting liberty, freedom, democracy, and those perceived as oppressive, dictatorial.
And while it clearly favored the U.S. and its allies,
Right, at the expense of the Soviet Union, it also, crucially, committed the U.S. to upholding a whole new geopolitical architecture for the post-1945 era.
So American financial and military support became critical.
A critical lifeline for many nations in the 40s and 50s. And that powerful rhetoric laid the essential groundwork for future interventions, alliances, long-term commitments, not just in Greece and Turkey, but across the Middle East and beyond. It was basically a declaration of ideological warfare, setting the stage for decades of Cold War engagement.
So what does all this mean for us today, looking back at these historical statements?
It highlights how terms like Iron Curtain and later Evil Empire or Axis of Evil are far from just descriptive labels.
They matter greatly because they frequently help to legitimate, maybe more importantly, justify subsequent actions, statesmanship, foreign policy decisions.
Precisely. These powerful geographical descriptions aren't just empty words. They serve as an absolutely essential element in formulating and implementing foreign and security policies. They shape public opinion and provide the rationale for actions with global ramifications.
Which leads to a fascinating question. Can these powerful, ingrained geographical descriptions ever be overturned?
And the answer is a resounding yes. They can be dramatically, almost instantly overturned by events on the ground.
Like the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 1989.
A perfect example. That single event led to an immediate radical reevaluation of Eastern and Central Europe by both American and Russian governments.
The phrase Iron Curtain just didn't make sense anymore.
Not politically, not geographically, as democratic movements swept away former communist regimes, opening up societies closed for decades.
And then just 2 years later, the so-called evil empire itself.
The Soviet Union disintegrated entirely in 1991, dissolved into multiple independent states.
And the Cold War security organization, NATO, which was created specifically to counter Soviet power.
Right, created in 1949. It then expanded to include former Eastern Bloc states, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary.
Which, from Russia's perspective,
This expansion, this gradual encroachment of an opposing military alliance closer to its borders, has been viewed with mounting concern, even outright hostility.
fundamentally shifting the geopolitical landscape again and creating new tensions that we still see playing out today.
Exactly. It's a continuous process.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Because we're moving from high-level speeches and foreign policy into something much more subtle, more pervasive.
How these ideas filter down.
Yeah, how these geopolitical ideas filter down into the public sphere, often through channels we don't even think of as inherently political. Let's dive into Edward Said's powerful concept of geographical imagination.
Said, yes.
Which is essentially how places are imagined and represented in art, literature, music, and of course in Western foreign policy making. It's that collective mental picture we build of a place, even if we've never set foot there.
And what's profoundly revealing here is how deeply impactful these imaginations can be, shaping not just policy, but public sentiment.
Take the example of Palestinians, or maybe more broadly, the wider Arabic world.
Right. Edward Said, himself a Palestinian-American scholar and a towering figure in post-colonial studies, was deeply sensitive to how these communities were consistently understood in, well, unflattering terms.
Stereotyped as unstable, threatening, or just exotic.
Often, yes. And his concern, articulated so powerfully in his work, was that these pervasive cultural understandings could be meticulously cultivated and then essentially weaponized.
Weaponized to rally policymakers and public opinion in ways that were fundamentally against the goal of an autonomous Palestinian community.
Precisely. If Palestinians are widely perceived through these ingrained imaginations as inherently dangerous or untrustworthy, it becomes far easier for others, like pro-Israeli supporters, to marginalize their plight.
Or dismiss calls for self-determination, rationalize the continued occupation of the West Bank, the security wall.
Exactly. It forces us to confront a difficult question. Who, in good conscience, would wish to support a people so consistently labeled as harborers of terrorists or agents of chaos?
It shows how deeply ingrained and emotionally powerful these manufactured images can become, influencing not just abstract policy debates, but fundamental human empathy and political will.
Absolutely.
And it's not just in traditional media or diplomatic circles. Let's shift to a very contemporary example that might surprise some listeners. Video games.
The digital battleground.
Right. If you check out websites like kumawar.org, you'll find a whole range of video games explicitly designed for participants eager to recreate U.S. military engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Including graphic simulations of really brutal events, like the assault on Fallujah in 2004.
So what are the implications of these virtual battlefields?
Well, they're quite profound because they actively shape geopolitical understandings. In these games, users aren't just passively playing, they're encouraged to use satellite imagery, mapping, to plan military campaigns.
The game companies even solicit real soldiers for their combat experiences, blurring the lines between simulation and reality.
They do. But here's the critical, often disturbing part.
Uh-huh.
Within the game's logic, Iraqi civilians and/or suspected militants are frequently depicted as either mere obstacles or just faithless adversaries that need to be killed, usually in large numbers, to achieve the mission objectives.
So it demonstrates how these geographical representations help to inform people's understandings of the world.
Exactly. It transforms complex conflicts and human lives into mere gameplay elements,
Yeah.
often stripping away their humanity, simplifying complex political realities into these binary us versus them scenarios. It's a powerful, often subconscious form of geopolitical conditioning.
This brings us neatly to the concept of popular geopolitics.
Where political life gets fused with the mass media.
Exactly. Think about something as high-profile and ritualistic as the American president's State of the Union address.
A major event every January.
Right. It's not just a speech. It's this huge, nationally televised opportunity for the president to convey their vision for the country and, crucially, for the wider world.
And as part of that grand tour of global affairs, the address frequently uses a whole series of geopolitical codes to rank countries, allies, dangers.
It's televised globally, analyzed endlessly by experts, and coming from the leader of arguably the most powerful state, it gets massive international media attention. It becomes part of everyday conversations worldwide.
That's right. And if we connect this back, consider President George W. Bush's State of the Union in January 2002. Just months after 9/11.
Americans were still reeling, looking for reassurance, direction.
And Bush delivered this explicit, dramatic geopolitical evaluation. He said, "Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction."
He named names, too.
He did. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror.
And he described Iraq specifically as having plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade and using poison gas against its own citizens.
And he concluded with that resolute declaration, "I will not stand by as peril draws closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons."
That section, especially the now infamous phrase axis of evil for Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, it just immediately captured immense global attention, sparked huge debate.
Oh, absolutely. And those three countries definitely took notice.
Their government strongly criticized the address, denounced the U.S. mainly to reassure their own domestic audiences. Right?
Primarily, yes, and rally support. From President Bush's perspective, the phrase axis of evil was intended as a proverbial shot across the bows.
A clear warning shot to states the U.S. disapproved of.
Exactly. But beyond that, it also served this brilliant, if simplified, rhetorical purpose. It provided a very simple, easily digestible geographical template of the world.
Categorizing complex nations into a neat us versus them framework.
Right. And by the time he returned to this theme in the 2003 State of the Union, the rhetoric had hardened even further. Saddam Hussein in particular was identified as a brutal dictator with a history of reckless aggression, with ties to terrorism, who will not be permitted to dominate a vital region and threaten the United States.
This brings us to a critical question. While few would dispute Saddam Hussein's brutality, this kind of layered description woven into a national address, it was crucial in preparing the ground, wasn't it?
Absolutely crucial, preparing the ground both domestically and internationally for the invasion of Iraq in March 2003.
That explicit link to terrorism and WMDs, even if unproven, proved incredibly enticing, persuasive to many Americans.
It did. They initially lent strong support to President Bush's decision for military action.
So why was it so remarkably effective? Especially when many respected experts, here and elsewhere, were openly doubtful of those connections.
Well, in part, it seems many Americans were simply unwilling to question the judgment of the president and his close colleagues, like Vice President Cheney.
To do so might risk being labeled unpatriotic or un-American, like in the Cold War McCarthy era.
Exactly. That charge was famously leveled at public figures like the Dixie Chicks, actors like Martin Sheen, intellectuals like Noam Chomsky who dared to express dissent. The social pressure to conform was immense.
And a huge contributing factor was the media, right? The overwhelming support from mainstream print and television media, which largely echoed the Bush administration's narrative.
Absolutely. A significant portion of Americans, remember, rely solely on television for their news. And many of those viewers aren't well-traveled, nor do they actively seek out alternative media sources like online papers from other English-speaking countries.
It's sometimes hard for non-Americans to fully grasp, but at the time, over 80% of American citizens didn't even possess a passport.
That profound lack of direct international experience contributes significantly to a reliance on simple geographical descriptions and narratives used by leaders. It makes it easier to convey a clear sense of geopolitical difference between the U.S. and others, easier to accept simplistic portrayals.
What's truly fascinating here is how that 2002 State of the Union profoundly shaped public perception. It essentially cemented a particular narrative in the American mind.
Yeah, it helps create this powerful, if unfounded, mental link.
That Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq was somehow directly connected to the 9/11 attacks.
Despite there being no clear, verifiable evidence linking that secular regime to Islamic militancy or al-Qaeda, yet enough Americans were content to accept that geographical and ideological linkage.
Which then provided a powerful justification for the administration to persuade citizens that invading Iraq after Afghanistan was a vital, necessary next step in the global war on terror.
And while certainly not all Americans were swayed, a sufficient and critical mass were prepared to accept the words and behavior of their president. It just illustrates the immense power of geopolitical framing.
And this cultural conditioning, this reinforcing of geopolitical narratives, it extended powerfully into Hollywood, too.
Oh, definitely. By November 2004, John Kerry, the Democratic challenger, couldn't deny George W. Bush a second term. Enough voters were persuaded the Republican Party was better equipped to secure America from this amorphous yet ever-present threat of terrorism.
And maybe popular culture didn't help the Democrats' case. Some of the biggest Hollywood hits from that era,
like Die Another Day in 2002, Collateral Damage also 2002, Sum of All Fears from 2001.
they all consistently depicted the U.S. as gravely imperiled by shadowy terrorists, hostile governments scattered across the globe.
With particular emphasis on North Korea and the Middle East.
Right. Take the James Bond film Die Another Day. Even the quintessential British super spy was working hand in glove with his American colleagues.
To prevent a crazed North Korean colonel from eradicating South Korea and Japan with some powerful satellite weapon.
And after the film's release, the actual North Korean regime formally remonstrated with the United States because of its highly negative depiction.
They did. And it's worth noting, this diplomatic protest remarkably coincided with the American president's very public description of their country as part of an axis of evil.
Wow, that convergence of pop culture narratives and official geopolitical labeling.
Combined with the ongoing efforts of the Department of Homeland Security, its pervasive security briefings, the color-coded threat levels, it all contributed significantly to a climate of anxiety and fear.
And in that environment, many Americans were simply unwilling to risk changing presidential leadership. Whether the uncertainty was truly existential or just perceived through this carefully constructed geopolitical lens.
Exactly.
Now, it's important to note, it's not just American presidents who wield such stark, powerful geopolitical language.
No, absolutely not.
Consider the then-president Ahmadinejad of Iran. In October 2005, he gave a speech to thousands of students in Tehran.
Telling them unequivocally that Israel must be wiped off the map.
That wasn't just about Iran's specific ambitions, it was deeply provocative,
Yeah.
with immediate, far-reaching implications across the whole Middle East and beyond.
And what's truly fascinating here is the dual, often contradictory impact of pronouncements like that.
How so?
Well, for Israel and its staunch allies, particularly the U.S., Ahmadinejad's public denunciation, his explicit desire to fundamentally rewrite the political map.
It nourished a geographical imagination based on the notion that Israel faces a genuine existential threat.
Exactly. A pervasive sense that it's perpetually surrounded by neighbors determined to end its very existence. It plays right into historical anxieties.
However, for others less sympathetic to Israel's position,
Including significant elements within Iran and across the wider Arab and Muslim world, the speech was interpreted very differently, as a powerful sign of geopolitical bravado.
they saw a leader standing up for the Palestinians, asserting Iran's regional influence, confronting U.S. and Israeli ambitions.
Precisely. Determined to stand up for the long marginalized Palestinians, assert Iran's regional influence, and directly confront what they saw as entrenched Israeli ambitions in the West Bank and southern Lebanon, as well as American hegemonic goals in the region.
This example really reinforces the idea that the link between leaders' pronouncements and their diverse audiences, intended or not, is an incredibly important dynamic component of geopolitics.
Absolutely. Language, in this context, is both a weapon and a tool for shaping reality.
Let's dive even deeper now into how geopolitics shapes not just our policies, but our very identities, how it profoundly influences how we view self and others.
This is fundamental. When President Reagan famously described the Soviet Union as the evil empire,
He was unequivocally clear in his own mind that the United States was, by stark contrast, a virtuous force for good in the world.
right, it wasn't just about foreign policy, it was about defining who we were.
And the cinematic analogy is almost unavoidable, isn't it?
It is. As a former Hollywood actor, Reagan might not have explicitly said a good empire, but anyone familiar with Star Wars back then would have immediately grasped the implication. The Soviet Union was unequivocally the dark side.
With the Soviet leader as the proverbial Darth Vader?
Exactly. And this role of the other, casting the Soviet Union as the ultimate antagonist, was vitally important in American self-understandings during the Cold War.
It didn't just identify a danger, it reinforced the U.S. self-identity as a beacon of freedom, a moral force.
Yes, a necessary counterpoint to perceived global tyranny. And this filters down. Consider conservative talk show host Michael Savage.
What did he say?
On his show, The Savage Nation, in 2003, in the wake of 9/11, he told his listeners flat out, "We are the good ones and they, the Arabs, are the evil ones."
And his show had a massive audience.
Huge. 8 million listeners at the time, syndicated to over 370 radio stations across the U.S. It just shows the immense pervasive reach of these identity-defining geopolitical narratives, filtering into everyday conversations, reinforcing simplified, often dangerous binaries.
But these clear-cut moral geographies weren't universally accepted, were they?
Oh, not at all. The Soviet Union, for many, wasn't an evil empire, but a liberating force. Even a communist utopia, particularly for some anti-colonial movements, left-leaning intellectuals globally.
And conversely, the United States was considered an evil empire by others. I mean, the author recounts this really striking experience.
In a cafe in Beirut, July 2003.
Yeah, where a Lebanese man told him, quite matter-of-factly, that America remained the great Satan.
Even while they were sharing views on Hollywood and American music, which the man greatly enjoyed. A fascinating dissonance.
It's a deeply striking contradiction, isn't it? It lays bare the profound complexity of geopolitical identity and allegiance.
Absolutely. And one can only imagine how that Lebanese man's perception of America's geopolitical presence might have been further cemented, maybe even radicalized, by the events of summer 2006.
The widespread destruction of Beirut by Israeli bombers and missiles, bombings significantly funded and facilitated by American foreign aid.
Right. It raises a crucial question about how specific actions by states can deeply entrench or even dramatically alter perceptions of national identity and allegiance among affected populations, even when personal cultural preferences might suggest otherwise.
It underscores that geopolitics isn't just about maps on a wall, it's about lived experience and its profound impact on identity.
Precisely.
And speaking of maps, geopolitics is also incredibly visual. Maps often seem so definitive, objective, like undeniable scientific truths.
We tend to trust them implicitly, don't we?
We do. But as we've learned throughout this deep dive, maps can be incredibly powerful tools for shaping perceptions. They can deliberately mislead or distort reality.
Through subtle omission, clever color coding, even the choice of projection.
They can overemphasize some places, quietly influencing our understanding of global power and importance without us even realizing we're being nudged.
And this is where the power of maps can become truly chilling. Consider, for instance, those German maps produced in the 1920s and 30s.
The ones depicting international Jewry as an octopus.
Yes. Its tentacles reaching across the globe, suffocating nations. This wasn't just some random artistic choice. It was a deliberate, insidious attempt to besmirch the reputation of that particular community and paint them as a global threat.
By graphically exaggerating their perceived power and nefarious influence.
The Nazis systematically prepared the cultural and geographical ground for their subsequent murderous policies, which culminated in the Holocaust.
And while those maps were clearly only one element in that horrific campaign,
They undeniably helped to shape the geographical imaginations of ordinary Germans. making monstrous actions seem almost logical within that distorted worldview, even if many individuals were capable of resisting such overt propaganda. Sadly, not enough to prevent genocide.
It illustrates the profound and terrifying power of visual geopolitical representations.
Absolutely terrifying.
And beyond such extreme examples, this manipulation extends to other forms of media. Films, magazines, television, the internet.
Everywhere.
Take the satirical Hollywood comedy Wag the Dog from 1997.
Ah, great film.
It features an American president caught in a sexual crisis right before his reelection. His advisors, desperate for a foreign policy diversion,
decide a crisis has suddenly emerged, threatening U.S. security. And the country supposedly imperiling the U.S. is
Albania.
Albania.
Right.
And what's truly fascinating is how the film meticulously depicts the advisors hiring a top Hollywood producer.
Who then manufactures a short, highly realistic film clip of a desperate girl running from a village, supposedly fleeing Albanian attackers.
Exactly. And in this elaborate, fabricated scenario, U.S. forces are supposedly dispatched to tackle the fabricated threat from these Albanian terrorists.
And throughout this White House-inspired diversion, the U.S. media and public are shown as incredibly gullible, easily manipulated by this fake footage.
And of course, the president's approval ratings soar because of his firm, decisive action against the non-existent Albanian threat. It was such a biting commentary on media, politics, and public perception.
And while many film critics quickly pointed to the real-world parallels, President Clinton's own scandals and the subsequent 1999 U.S.-NATO assault on Serbia,
the film's satirical effectiveness also kind of hinged on the audience's underlying, perhaps subconscious credulity, that a country like Albania might actually harbor terrorists with, say, a nuclear bomb.
Right.
And what's also intriguing is that Albania, being a Muslim country in a lesser-known corner of Europe, was unfortunately often stereotyped by other Europeans as well. Claustrophobic, criminalized, and confusing.
So this pre-existing geographical imagination made the film's absurd premise, however exaggerated, oddly relatable to some.
Possibly, yes. And ironically, the Serbian authorities themselves, in a real-world act of geopolitical counter-propaganda, broadcast the film to their domestic viewers.
To try and discredit President Clinton's decision to attack Serbian forces in Kosovo and Serbia?
Exactly. It just highlights how geopolitical narratives can be swiftly deployed, reinterpreted, and weaponized by different actors for their own strategic purposes. And it's worth remembering the tragic, real-world stakes. The U.S. NATO forces were dispatched in '99 specifically to prevent Serbian forces from implementing further attacks and ethnic cleansing against the predominantly Muslim Kosovo community.
And further emphasizing this point, in March 1999, President Clinton even explicitly explained the situation to American TV viewers about Kosovo. He actually said, "Take a look at this map. Kosovo is a small place, but it sits on a major fault line between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, at the meeting place of Islam and both the Western and Orthodox branches of Christianity."
He pointed to surrounding allies, other small countries facing challenges,
and warned ominously that all the ingredients for a major war are there.
If we connect this to the broader picture, Clinton, much like President Roosevelt during WWII, urging Americans to understand the global conflict, was explicitly calling on viewers to literally look to their maps.
To actively engage with the visual representation of geopolitics, to understand the complex geopolitics of Southeast Europe.
Exactly. And this example, like all the others we discussed today, from historical speeches to video games, presidential addresses to manipulative maps, profoundly underscores that geopolitics is not merely an academic pursuit.
Not confined to textbooks or university departments?
Not at all. It is a dynamic, pervasive, often subtle activity that deserves our deep reflection, precisely because it is an essential daily part of everyday life, whether you're in the U.S., Europe, or anywhere else on the planet.
It is unequivocally smart to think geopolitically.
To understand the forces shaping our world and to critically evaluate the narratives presented to us, it's essential.
Wow, what an incredible deep dive this has been. We've seen today that geopolitics is so much more than just news headlines about distant conflicts or abstract concepts debated by diplomats.
It's a powerful, often hidden force, woven right into the fabric of our daily lives, actively shaping our perceptions through the language we hear, the maps we see, the media we consume.
From Churchill's iconic Iron Curtain defining a whole era to the virtual battlefields of video games shaping how we view conflict.
And the powerful pronouncements of world leaders framing entire nations. How we perceive and label places and people directly impacts global events with very real, often devastating consequences.
So by truly understanding these mechanisms, how geographical templates get created and strategically deployed, how identity is shaped by that powerful concept of the other.
And how popular culture can relentlessly reinforce powerful geopolitical narratives, you are far better equipped to critically evaluate the overwhelming flow of information and narratives presented to you every single day.
This critical awareness doesn't just make you informed, it really empowers you to become an active, discerning participant in our globally interconnected world.
Rather than just a passive observer swayed by the prevailing winds of rhetoric.
So as you go about your week, we want to leave you with this provocative thought, something to truly ponder. In a world saturated with carefully crafted information and powerful images,
How conscious are you of the geopolitical templates and imaginations that subtly or maybe overtly shape your own understanding of distant lands and peoples?
and what impact might that deeply ingrained understanding have on the world around you, and maybe even on your choices within it?
Keep exploring, keep questioning.
And keep diving deep.